My name is Sarah Mitchell, and I'm sitting in my apartment in Portland, Oregon, recording this on a Tuesday evening in March. The weather outside is crisp, around 45 degrees, and I have the window open because cold air has become something I need to feel in order to trust that I'm safe. It's been almost 2 years since that night, but I still can't handle being warm and enclosed at the same time without my chest tightening. My daughter, Emma, she's 9 now, and she sleeps with 2 nightlights on. Her therapist says she's making good progress, which is what people say when they mean the trauma is still there, but it's manageable. I want you to understand something from the very beginning. What happened to us wasn't an isolated incident. It was the crescendo of a symphony of control that had been building for months, and by the time that apartment door locked behind us on a 0-degree night, I was so worn down, so isolated, that I almost didn't have the strength to fight anymore. If you're listening right now, help me prove something wrong. My mother said I wouldn't even reach 1,000 subscribers, but I believe stories like this deserve to be heard. Help me show her that these tales matter. Please subscribe to Olive Revenge Stories, and let's keep breathing life into stories that were never meant to stay silent. Now, let's continue. The story doesn't begin on that balcony in February when the temperature dropped to 0 and my mother-in-law locked me and my 7-year-old daughter outside without coats, without shoes, without a single way to call for help. It begins 6 months earlier, in August, when my husband David came home from a long haul and told me his mother, Patricia, was having some difficulties living alone in her condo in Denver. She'd been divorced for 12 years. She was stubborn as they come, and she'd refused every suggestion that she move to a senior living community or stay with David's brother in Arizona. Patricia was the kind of woman who measured her independence in acts of defiance, who saw asking for help as a personal failure, and who believed that suffering silently was somehow more noble than admitting you needed someone. David loved his mother, but I'd always noticed something in his body language when he was around her. A tension, a flinching. He was 42 years old, and around her, he moved like a man trying not to make any wrong moves. I should have recognized that for what it was. I should have understood that she'd spent decades training him to believe that his job was to manage her emotions, absorb her criticism, and make her feel powerful. But I was tired that August night. Emma had just finished 2nd grade, and the idea of being a good daughter-in-law, of being the kind of woman who stepped up when family needed her, felt important to me. It felt like the right thing to do. "She's lonely," David said, and I heard the guilt in his voice. "The doctors say her blood pressure is elevated. She's not eating right. I've been thinking, what if we asked her to stay with us for a little while? Just until she gets back on her feet. We have the spare room upstairs." Denver isn't far from our home in Colorado Springs, just an hour and 15 minutes north. It seemed manageable. It seemed kind. I didn't know yet that kindness was something Patricia weaponized. She would use it against me constantly, reminding me years later that I was the one who insisted she stay with us, painting herself as a burden I'd been desperate to take on. But in that moment, in August, with David looking at me with those grateful, relieved eyes, I said yes. Patricia moved in on a Tuesday morning with 3 suitcases, a detailed list of her dietary requirements, and an energy that immediately filled every room of our house like water seeking the lowest point. She was 68 years old, tall and broad-shouldered, with steel-gray hair she wore in a tight bun and pale blue eyes that seemed to evaluate everything they landed on. She wore black pants and white blouses, always, and she had this habit of straightening things after people touched them. I watched her come into our kitchen on that first morning and systematically reorganize the spice rack while Emma and I were trying to make breakfast. Emma asked her if she needed help, the way I'd taught her to be respectful to elders, and Patricia responded by telling her that children in her day didn't interrupt adults who were working. Emma was 7 years old. She said, "Okay, I'm sorry," and something in me clenched, because I could see the moment my daughter learned that her presence was perhaps not welcome, that her natural instinct to be helpful was actually a form of bothering people. The first month was almost normal. Patricia was quiet, sometimes in a way that felt purposeful, like her silence was a comment on something. She ate dinner with us, but rarely contributed to conversation. She spent long hours in her room, and David seemed relieved, grateful that she was giving us space. He'd check on her in the afternoons, bringing her tea and asking if she needed anything, and I could see him relaxing slightly when she didn't criticize anything or demand anything. But by September, things began to shift. It started with the thermostat. Patricia complained constantly that the house was too warm. She'd wake up at 5 in the morning and lower the temperature to 62 degrees, and she'd leave it there all day, even though I was home with Emma, and even though it meant my daughter was wearing sweatshirts indoors in late summer. When I'd gently adjust it back to a comfortable temperature, Patricia would notice immediately. "Someone's keeping it warm in here like a tropical greenhouse," she'd say, loud enough for all of us to hear, the implication being that I was wasteful, spoiled, and didn't have the discipline that people of her generation possessed. David would stay silent on these occasions, and his silence felt like agreement. It felt like he was conceding that his mother's way was the better way. Then came the food. Emma is a normal child. She likes chicken nuggets and pasta and peanut butter sandwiches. She has never been a kid who eats elaborate meals, but she's also not a picky eater in the sense of being rude or disrespectful about food. She just has preferences, the way all humans do. But Patricia seemed to view Emma's normal childhood preferences as a personal insult. She'd make these elaborate dinners and then watch Emma with visible disappointment when she asked for something simpler. Children who don't eat what's prepared become ungrateful adults, Patricia announced one evening, and I felt David tense beside me at the dinner table, and I realized this was something she'd said to him, probably dozens of times over the course of his childhood. September turned into October, and I noticed that Patricia had stopped leaving the house at all. She'd mentioned having friends in Denver, but she never called them, never made plans. Instead, she became increasingly focused on what Emma and I were doing. She'd comment on my parenting constantly in that indirect way that made it hard to push back because it was never a direct criticism. She'd say things like, "I suppose that's how parents do things these days," or, "Well, I wouldn't have let my children behave that way, but I'm sure times have changed." She'd correct Emma's grammar, critique her posture, tell her that she was being too loud when she was just playing normally in the other room. One day, Emma came out of her room excited because she'd drawn a picture of our family for school. It was a typical 7-year-old drawing, me and her and David represented as colorful stick figures holding hands, with a big yellow sun in the corner. Patricia looked at it and said, "The proportions are quite poor. And your mother's head is too large. You might want to redo this before you turn it in." Emma's face crumpled. She went back to her room and came out an hour later with the drawing thrown away. I felt rage rise in my chest so intense that I had to leave the kitchen, but when I tried to talk to David about it, he became defensive. "She's just trying to help. She's just giving honest feedback," he said, and I realized with a sinking feeling that I was watching my daughter begin to absorb the same patterns that had shaped my husband's entire life. The belief that criticism was love. The belief that having someone constantly evaluate your worth was what family did. The turning point came in late October during what should have been a normal dinner. It was a Thursday night, and I'd made pasta with marinara sauce and salad and garlic bread. Emma was hungry from soccer practice and ate normally, but she also left some pasta on her plate. She was finished, genuinely finished, her belly satisfied, her mind already moving on to whether she could watch 20 minutes of television before bed. Patricia set down her fork deliberately. The clink of it against the plate sounded loud in the kitchen. "Emma," she said, and my daughter's whole body went still. "Look at all that food you've wasted. Do you have any idea how much suffering there is in this world? Children in Africa are starving, and you're throwing perfectly good food in the trash like it's nothing." Emma looked at me, fear in her eyes, and I made the mistake of telling her it was okay. She could be done. "No," Patricia said. "She's going to sit at this table until that plate is clean. That's what children who have respect do." I told my daughter to go upstairs, that she was finished, that she didn't have to eat anything she didn't want to eat. Patricia looked at me and said, "And that is exactly why your generation of children is so ungrateful and weak. You coddle them. You make them think they don't have to face consequences." I felt something break open in my chest. This woman had wormed her way into our home, into our family's rituals, into the space where I was supposed to be the authority, and she was undermining me in front of my own child. When I told David about it later, when I explained that his mother had refused to let Emma leave the table, that she'd shamed her for being full, that this was not acceptable, David said, "She's just doing what she thinks is right. She raised me this way." And then, the words that I think define the moment everything became dangerous, and I turned out fine. The weeks between November and February were a slow descent into something that I didn't have the language for at the time, but now understand was psychological abuse designed to isolate me and weaken my ability to protect my child. Patricia had begun timing when David left for his routes. He drives long haul, which means he'd be gone for 3 to 5 days at a time, sometimes more during peak season. Once he left, Patricia's behavior changed entirely. She'd make comments about how she'd raised David by herself after the divorce, how much she'd sacrificed, how David owed her everything, including a debt of gratitude that I apparently needed to understand I would never be worthy of repaying. She'd tell Emma that her mother was spoiling her, that I was weak, that the only people you can really trust are your parents, and everyone else will eventually abandon you. She'd wake Emma up early in the morning before school started and talk to her about how grateful she should be, how much her grandmother had given up for the family, how people nowadays didn't understand the value of obedience. She'd follow me around the house commenting on things I was doing wrong. I was using too much water for laundry. I was leaving lights on. I was spending too much money on groceries. I was being selfish for wanting to take Emma to her soccer games because driving consumed gasoline. The isolation happened slowly enough that I almost didn't notice it until I realized that I hadn't seen my friends in weeks, that I'd stopped calling my own mother, that I'd become so focused on managing Patricia's mood and minimizing conflict that I'd lost track of myself entirely. December was when I first called my mom and told her I needed her to come visit us. There was something in my voice that made her say yes immediately, that made her rearrange her schedule and drive down from Wyoming. I didn't tell her about the thermostat or the food comments or the way Patricia talked to Emma. I didn't have the words yet. But when my mom arrived and spent 3 days with us, I watched her sit in the living room and quietly observe Patricia, and I saw her expression shift from confused to horrified. On her last night with us, she pulled me aside in the kitchen and said, "Honey, that woman is cruel. That woman is deliberately unkind to that little girl, and your husband is letting it happen." I started crying, and I realized I'd been holding this conversation inside my head for months, without actually saying it out loud to anyone. My mom told me that I needed to talk to David seriously, that this was not normal, that Patricia's presence was poisoning our home. David, when my mom brought it up, became defensive. He said she didn't understand his mother, that she was lonely and struggling, that she was trying to bond with Emma, that I was being overly sensitive and dramatic. My mom left, hugging me tightly at the car and making me promise to call her if things got worse. They did. January was a blur of cold temperatures and my nerves being permanently on high alert. Patricia had stopped even pretending to be pleasant. She'd make dinner and then watch while we ate, her presence at the table like the weight of judgment. She'd comment on everything, how I'd cut the vegetables, how I'd seasoned the food, how Emma was chewing, how David was asking for seconds like he didn't know when to stop. Emma had begun having stomachaches before meals. She'd come to me and ask if she could go to the bathroom instead of eating with her grandmother. At school, her teacher pulled me aside at pickup and asked if everything was okay at home because Emma had been withdrawn in class, quiet in a way that wasn't normal for her. I told the teacher that we were managing some family transitions, which was the understatement of the century. David was barely home. And when he was home, he was exhausted or stressed about the road or worried about his mother's feelings. I don't think he understood that by defending his mother constantly, by refusing to acknowledge that her behavior was harmful, he was making a choice. He was choosing her over us. February came with a record cold snap. Colorado had been experiencing a brutal winter, and the forecast was predicting temperatures that would drop below zero for the first time in years. On the day that everything changed, I'd woken up with a sense of dread so intense that I'd considered calling David and asking him to cut his route short and come home. But I didn't. I was afraid of his response, afraid of being labeled dramatic, afraid of pushing too hard and having him tell me that I was the problem, not his mother. Emma went to school like normal. I packed her lunch, a turkey sandwich with the crusts cut off and some fruit, and she hugged me goodbye. That was the last normal moment of my life before everything fractured. The afternoon was gray and cold. The weather service was issuing warnings about wind chills and frostbite. By 3 o'clock, the wind was so strong that it was pushing against the windows. Patricia was in her room. I was doing laundry. Emma came home from school, and I gave her a snack, apple slices and cheese, and she sat at the kitchen table while I worked. Around 4 o'clock, Patricia came downstairs. She was wearing her usual black pants and white blouse, and her hair was done up in her usual tight bun. She looked at Emma eating her snack and said, "Still eating, I see. No wonder you're getting thick." Emma was a healthy, normal-weight 7-year-old. She wasn't thick. She wasn't overweight. She was a child. But the words landed, and I saw Emma's shoulders curve inward slightly, saw her stop eating even though she was hungry. I told Patricia that comment wasn't appropriate, that she shouldn't speak to Emma that way. Her eyes narrowed. "You've done a poor job of teaching that child respect," she said. "She ignores me. She refuses to listen. She's becoming exactly the kind of selfish, ungrateful person the world doesn't need." I felt something shift inside me, a line that I hadn't known I was willing to cross being crossed. I told her that was enough, that she needed to go back to her room, that I was done with her comments and her judgment and her constant attempts to hurt my daughter. Patricia's face went very still. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, in a voice so low it was almost a whisper, "You think you're her mother. You think you get to decide what's best for her. You're wrong, and you're going to see that tonight." Then she turned and walked back upstairs. I felt cold run through my body in a way that had nothing to do with the February weather. I told Emma to go play in the living room. I sat at the kitchen table, and I tried to convince myself that Patricia was just being dramatic, that it was just words, that nothing would actually happen. I was so tired. I'd been managing this situation for 6 months, and I was so tired that I'd almost stopped believing that I had the right to be angry about any of it. David called around 6 o'clock from somewhere in Nebraska. His signal was bad. He said he'd be back tomorrow night, that the road was okay so far, that he loved us. I didn't tell him about what Patricia had said. I don't know why. Fear, probably. The understanding that if I told him, he would defend her again, and I didn't have the emotional energy to fight that particular battle when my husband was hours away and his mother was upstairs in our house. I made dinner. Chicken, mashed potatoes, green beans, things I knew Emma liked. Patricia came downstairs and sat at the table. We ate in silence. Emma picked at her food, anxious about what was coming, sensing the tension the way children do. I was watching Patricia, trying to read her face, trying to understand what she meant when she said I'd see things tonight. Maybe she meant she was planning to have another argument with me. Maybe she meant she was going to give me the silent treatment. Maybe she meant any number of things that didn't include what actually happened. After dinner, Emma went upstairs to get ready for bed. I was loading the dishwasher. Patricia stood and watched me. She didn't say anything, just watched, her presence a weight in the kitchen. When I finished, I told her I was going to go up and tuck Emma in, and I turned to leave. She said my name. I stopped. She said, "I've been thinking about what you said. About respect. I think it's time that little girl learned that there are consequences for being disrespectful to her elders. I think it's time she learned what respect actually means." I asked her what she meant, and she didn't answer. She just went back to sitting at the table. I went upstairs, unsettled, my heart already starting to race with a panic I couldn't fully explain. I tucked Emma into bed and read her a story. I checked the locks on her window. I kissed her forehead. I tried to make everything feel normal, even though nothing felt normal anymore. Around 9:30, I was downstairs in the living room with a cup of tea, sitting in the dark, when Patricia came in. She turned on the light suddenly, and I jumped. She said, "Emma needs to come downstairs. She didn't show respect this evening, and she's going to learn her lesson tonight." I asked her what she was talking about, and she said that Emma had given her a disrespectful look at dinner, that Emma needed to be taught that actions had consequences. I told her absolutely not, that I wasn't going to pull my 7-year-old out of bed at night to participate in some punishment, that this had gone too far. Patricia's face went very still, the same way it had earlier. She said, "Fine. Then you can both come with me." I asked where, and she said, "You'll see." I should have refused. Every instinct I had was screaming at me to refuse. But I was so conditioned by this point to avoid confrontation with her, to assume that somehow I was overreacting, that I found myself standing up and following her to the stairs. I went up to Emma's room and carried her down. She was drowsy, confused, asking what was happening. My mother-in-law didn't answer her. She walked to the sliding glass door that led to our back balcony. It was 9:45 at night. The temperature was 0 degrees Fahrenheit. The wind was so strong it was making the balcony door rattle. She opened the door. Cold air rushed in like something alive, bringing the smell of snow and the sound of wind that was almost deafening. She said to me, "Go outside." I said no. She said, "Then I'll just take Emma." I grabbed Emma's hand. I said, "If you're going out there, I'm coming with you." I was stalling, still thinking that somehow this would resolve itself, that she wouldn't actually do this, that it was some kind of bluff. But people like Patricia don't bluff. They follow through. She gestured toward the door, and something in me understood that she was serious. I was wearing a t-shirt and pajama pants. Emma was wearing a thin nightgown. Neither of us was wearing shoes. I walked toward the door, still thinking that if I complied, she would explain what this was about, that we'd come back inside, that somehow the boundaries of reason would reassert themselves. I was so wrong. The moment we stepped onto the balcony, the door slid shut behind us. I heard the lock click. The sound of a door being sealed shut is something I can still hear perfectly in my mind. It's like the sound of a trap snapping closed. I was barefoot on a concrete balcony in 0 degree Fahrenheit weather with my 7-year-old daughter in the dark. My body didn't panic. My body moved into survival mode. I picked Emma up and held her against my chest. I covered her body with my arms as much as I could. The balcony was small, maybe 8 feet by 6 feet, and there was nowhere to go, nowhere to hide from the wind. The cold was the kind of cold that doesn't feel cold anymore, it burns. My feet went numb almost instantly. Emma was shaking so hard I thought she might shake apart. She was crying, but the tears were freezing on her cheeks. I remember looking at my hands and seeing them turn white, and then a grayish color. I remember thinking about hypothermia, about the fact that even young children can develop hypothermia in a matter of minutes in these conditions. I remember thinking that I was going to have to explain to David why his mother had killed his child, and that he would probably blame me somehow. We were out there for maybe 5 minutes when I heard a voice from somewhere outside our balcony. A neighbor in the complex across the courtyard saw us. I can still see him in my mind, standing on his balcony in a gray bathrobe, his face shocked and disbelieving. He asked if we were okay. I screamed that we were locked outside, that we needed help. He said, "I'm calling 911 right now." The 5 minutes it took for the police to arrive felt like hours. The police officer who first knocked on our door was named Officer Mitchell, which felt like some kind of ironic twist of fate, given that was my last name too. Patricia opened the door, and he asked her what she'd done. She said we'd gone out there on our own, that it had been a misunderstanding, that we were fine. Officer Mitchell looked at my feet, which were pale and unresponsive, and at Emma, who was barely conscious from hypothermia, and he said something to Patricia that I've never forgotten. "You don't get to decide if a child is fine. That's not your decision to make." They took Emma to the emergency room. I rode with her in the ambulance, sitting there in my soaking wet pajamas, unable to stop shaking. Emma had mild hypothermia but no permanent physical damage, which I learned is sometimes a matter of luck rather than something you should count on happening. The doctor told me that another 5 minutes out there, and the situation could have been very different. They gave us warm blankets and asked what had happened, and I had to explain that my mother-in-law had locked us outside as a punishment. The pediatrician asked me to repeat that. She said, "Your mother-in-law locked you outside in 0 degree weather?" And I realized, saying it out loud to another adult, how absolutely insane that sounded. How crystal clear it was that this was not a discipline technique or a parenting choice or a teaching moment. This was deliberate harm. The police went back to our house, and arrested Patricia. Child endangerment, unlawful imprisonment, reckless endangerment. She spent one night in jail before a lawyer got her out on bail. David was devastated. He kept saying it didn't make sense, that his mother would never do something like that somehow this was a miscommunication or an accident. When he came to the hospital and I told him exactly what happened, he got very quiet. He said, "Maybe you provoked her. You were probably disrespectful." I looked at him, and I understood that his loyalty to his mother was so deeply embedded in his nervous system that even his child being locked outside in weather that could have killed her, even this wasn't enough to make him see clearly. He asked if I was sure about what happened. I said yes, I was sure. He asked if maybe I'd overreacted. He asked if maybe this was a teaching moment for Emma, if maybe Patricia was right that Emma needed to learn about consequences. I told him he was insane, and I meant it. I told him that I was taking Emma and leaving, that I didn't care what happened with the house or the legal proceedings, that we were not staying in a place where our safety wasn't protected. We left that night. I called my mom and told her we were coming to Wyoming, and she had a room ready for us within the hour. The legal case took months to resolve. Patricia's lawyer argued that it was a family matter, that she had no intent to harm anyone, that she was simply trying to discipline her granddaughter in the way she saw fit. The prosecutor looked at the medical records from Emma's hypothermia and the police report and the neighbor's testimony, and Patricia eventually took a plea deal. Community service. Probation. Required anger management classes, which she never completed. David's family split over the incident. His brother, who lives in Arizona, called me and told me he'd had similar experiences with their mother, that she'd done things like lock him in a closet when he was a child, that he'd been waiting for someone in the family to finally say something was wrong. But David couldn't say it was wrong. Even now, even after everything, he defends her sometimes. He says she was going through something. He says she was lonely. He says she was acting out because she felt rejected by his wife, which was apparently my fault for not being grateful enough for her presence in our home. Emma is 9 now, and she's in therapy. She has nightmares sometimes. She has anxiety about being cold. She doesn't like locked doors or enclosed spaces. She asks me sometimes if it was her fault, if she'd been more respectful to her grandmother, if maybe she deserved what happened. And every single time she asks, I tell her the truth. Nothing you did caused this. Your grandmother made a choice to hurt you. And your mother made a choice to protect you. The difference between my marriage and my safety became very clear to me during that time. I could either stay married to David and hope that eventually he'd see his mother for what she was, or I could protect my daughter and leave. I chose Emma. I divorced David 18 months after that night on the balcony. He fought me on custody for a while, but eventually accepted joint custody, and now Emma sees him every other weekend, which she's okay with. He's a better father when his mother isn't in the picture. I think he might even see now, years later, what happened. But I don't know if he'll ever fully acknowledge that his mother was capable of deliberately trying to harm his daughter. Some people aren't built for that kind of honesty. What I learned from this experience is that abuse doesn't announce itself. It doesn't come with a warning label. It comes slowly, disguised as concern for your family, dressed up in the language of tradition and respect and discipline. It teaches you that your instincts are wrong, that other people know better than you do what's good for your own child, that protecting someone you love is somehow selfish or dramatic or an overreaction. Patricia was a smart woman. She was strategic. She isolated me deliberately. She worked on my self-doubt and my desire to be a good daughter-in-law. She turned my husband into an unwilling accomplice by making him believe that his loyalty to his mother was more important than his loyalty to his wife and child. And on one dark February night, when I was so worn down that I was almost numb, she gave herself permission to cross a line that most people recognize as absolutely unforgivable. The question I keep asking myself, and the question I want to ask all of you listening, is how many people in your life are doing things that are similar but slightly less obvious? How many people are slowly eroding your confidence as a parent, subtly criticizing your child, introducing cold control mechanisms disguised as tradition? How many people are convincing you that their way is the right way while slowly poisoning your family from the inside? Sometimes the most dangerous person in a child's life is not a stranger. Sometimes it's someone with keys to your home, someone with a claim on your heart through family ties, someone who learned a long time ago that the best way to control people is to make them believe they're crazy for questioning you. I left that situation. I protected my daughter. I chose myself and my child over the idea that family is supposed to mean unconditional acceptance of cruelty. And I'm telling you this story because I want you to know that you don't have to stay in situations that are hurting you. You don't have to maintain relationships with people who are poisoning your home, even if they're blood relatives. You don't have to choose family over safety. If this story has shaken you, please share it with someone who needs to hear it. Please let people know that abuse comes in forms that aren't always obvious, that control can be disguised as love, and that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is walk away. What would you have done that night? Where do you draw the line with family? Comment below and let me know. And if you're ready for the next story, the next revelation, the next moment when someone's family became their greatest threat, hit that subscribe button. Because there are more stories out there, more survivors who need to be heard, more truths that deserve to live in the light. This is Sarah Mitchell, reminding you that your safety matters, your child's safety matters, and sometimes the most important act of love is knowing when to leave.